Welcome back to Refactoring PaleoRose. You might remember one of the first episodes we were looking at the contents in our Xcode project. What we found is that there's no real organization at all. So let's take a quick look at Xcode and see what's going on. Okay, here we are in Xcode. We can see that we have a number of directories, or I should say file folders, with files inside them. But if you take a quick look and pick one of these folders and look over to the right, you'll see that this folder doesn't actually represent a real directory on disk. It's just pointing to the top level of the project. And this isn't a great situation. It isn't necessarily horrible. I mean, this project works, it builds, it runs, it does all the things it needs to do, but it is not the nicest configuration for these files. So what can we do? Let's talk a moment about what kind of file organization we can have in Xcode. First off, you can have a wide variety of ways to organize all your files. And it's up to you and your team, if you have one, how you should go about doing this. There's no one prescriptive rule on how to set things up. Do it the way you want to. But Xcode does have its preference. You don't have to agree with that preference. You can actually do other things, but it will fight you a little bit. And that preference can be easily seen if you create a new project. It tends to want to keep all the files for target together. And some specific files will have an exact expected location. What I mean by that is the build settings in a project will likely point directly to a specific file, so it makes it a little bit trickier to move it. If you're doing certain kinds of projects like Swift Package Manager or a custom CocoaPod or something like that, you may have additional requirements placed on you. For example, Swift Package Manager requires all the source files and all the test files to be in certain locations. When you start a new project, what you will see are three subfolders: the project target, the unit test target, and the UI test target. And we can actually look at our test application that we started a few weeks ago. Okay, so here's our test application. You can see that it's subdivided all the files into these three categories: the test, which is the project, tests, which are the unit tests, and the UI test target. So each of these are different targets. So here are the target lists. They match up with the targets over here, and you can see all the files are within those directories. And that makes sense. And one thing you may notice is that these are very differently set up than what we had in our project, where each one of these folders are actually a subfolder in the overall Git repository. So this is a much cleaner way to manage your files. And this is the modern preferred way. When you organize things in this manner, whenever you drop a new file or create a new file within those directories, they are typically marked as belonging to that target. And that's very helpful because it helps manage files in such a way that you don't have to worry about it quite so much. Now, you don't have to obey these general behaviors. This is what I'm trying to communicate, is that you can do anything you want, but not fighting the system has its advantage. And again, if you follow these rules, you're much more likely to have all the right files in the right places and in the right build targets. So some files, of course, have specific file locations. For example, the info plist. You don't have to keep it as info plist, and you don't have to keep it where it is. It's more than possible to change the file name and change the location of that file if you want to. But doing so means that you have to make sure you go in and correctly configure your build settings to point to the right file. So generally speaking, most of the time you won't have to touch this, but if you start making more complex projects, you're going to have to start dealing with this problem. One thing to keep in mind too is beyond this top level view of how to organize files, there's also this localized view. What constitutes the reason to create a group? Well, first of all, we already talked about targets. You want to have a top level group for each of these targets. But within those groups, it gets a little bit more complicated. For example, you might want to keep certain files together. In other words, things that have like or similar functionality. For example, a window or a view might want to make a group for that particular window or view. And then you can just build out subgroups for each individual aspect of that particular group. Alternatively, you may want to organize around the app flow. How does the app flow? You want to go from screen to screen to screen. You can organize your groups around that flow. One thing you could do that's going to be a bit of a fight with Xcode is I like to keep my unit test files with the files that they test. That's a bit of a fight with Xcode because Xcode will tend to want to put those tests in the wrong target because you're putting it in the same overall target directory system. So that's an opinionated way of doing things. You don't have to do it that way. You can just do it the way Xcode is telling you. And finally, do you even need to bother with any of this kind of smaller organization? The reason why I add this here is because, you know what, you don't have to do any of this stuff if you don't want to. You can organize it any way you want with as little or as much structure as you want. And with the modern version of Xcode, maybe you don't have to do so much of this because the search features are so powerful. Before we go too much further, let me bring up a point about groups in Xcode. There are really three kinds of groups. One is groups without folders. These are simply a way of organizing files in Xcode, but actually do not represent that organization on disk. This was originally how Xcode was working and why the PaleoRose project is the way it is, because that was the original setup. Later came along the idea of groups with folders, where each of these folders in Xcode actually represents a real folder on disk. And Xcode manages the content of those folders. Now, if you went ahead and stuck a file in that folder, Xcode won't see it. You have to specifically add it to the project, into that group, and then it will be managed into that folder. And finally, you have folder references. These tend to be blue folder icons. These are pointing to a folder on disk, but it doesn't necessarily automatically bring in any of the content into the build process. What you can do with it is a great way to manage assets. You can put a bunch of stuff in there, you can change it around, and you don't have to do any other configuration. In Xcode, you be set up to copy that folder into the final product, for example. So if we look at PaleoRose, these are groups without a folder. In here, this blue icon, Xrose Help, is actually one of these folder reference. It's pointing to a real folder on disk, but Xcode isn't managing what's inside. So if I added a file into this folder on disk, it will show up here in Xcode. But Xcode isn't necessarily going to do anything with it. What we don't have, except for this one, this is the only folder that I'm aware of that actually points to a real folder. That's a bonus, I guess, but it's also pointing to a particular target, as you kind of would expect. So I have worked with this project before. I probably added these unit tests later, and that's why this folder is there. If we go to our test target, we can see that all these folders are pointing to a real folder on disk. There's not very many of them, so it's very, very simple, but the test target does point to real files on disk. What are my preferences? Well, my preference, of course, is I kind of alluded to that I like to group files together in certain ways. For example, nibs, zibs, and storyboards should always be associated with their views and view controller files so that you know exactly where they all are. One problem can crop up is that a view controller and the subsequent nib or storyboard file isn't named correctly or don't have the same names, and you have no idea that they're associated with one another. And that's actually a problem with PaleoRose. So always keep things together if possible. And my personal preference is that unit tests should always be with the files that they test. Again, this violates Xcode's personal preference. I still strongly like this because I like being able to see the test right next to the file that I'm working on. So I can have them side by side on screen, but I can also see them in the file list next to each other. I feel a little less strongly about this than I used to, but I still feel it's really nice to have them side by side. And the reason why I feel less strongly about it is the search features in Xcode are pretty good to be able to find the associated files. For larger scale grouping, do the best you can. I mean, it's a battle trying to figure out where things should be. I really don't have any good advice for you because it is very difficult to maintain good associations. I do like using the top level targets as base level file folders whenever possible. This is very handy. It's very cleanly defines all the content for a particular target. And once you get in there, you might run into problems trying to group files together because files can be grouped together in many different ways. This could be a view, this could be part of a app flow, this could be part of a window group. It can be grouped in many, many different ways. But as a system, we don't have any way to tag files as saying this is part of this is part of that, this is also part of this. And that is a difficulty. Not everybody likes tagging. Some people are really good at organization. I like tagging. I'm not that great at organization. But one of the great things about Xcode as it matures, it's getting easier to find files than it used to be. Xcode 15 has moved a lot along that route. All I can say is just do the best you can and realize that it's getting fairly easy to find things. And you may not need to spend a lot of time worrying about organization. With that said, let's go back to PaleoRose. So here we are back in PaleoRose. We can see that we don't really have our top level organization. We do have this one folder reference, but everything else is kind of organized in a kind of a strange way, which often happens when you're working on a project. You're just trying to organize things as you go, and things don't work out that well in the end. But you can see some of the groupings that I tend to prefer. Here's a view controller, essentially. It's right next to its associated zip. But you can also see that I don't always do that in this project. So I have a whole bunch of zibs that are in the resources folder, which I don't think is a particularly great setup. Again, more zibs in the resources folder. I don't like that at all. What about tests? I only have 2 test files. Let's see if they're grouped. So these are together, which is good. And these are together, which is good. Again, you may prefer to keep your tests separate in the separate target. I like to keep them next to each other. It makes it easy for me to see whether or not tests exist for that particular file. Now, I'm not going to go through and force you to sit through me making all the changes. So I'm going to do the changes all at once so you don't have to look at them. Okay. Here we are in the updated version of the project. So you can see that I have a target level folder for the project. I also have a unit tests folder as well. And I still have this frameworks library directory as well. Now, I haven't gone through and completely restructured this. But what I have done is all these folders now represent real directories on disk. In some ways, I've also simplified organization. If you remember when we looked at this grouping of files, this used to be in a big pile of files, but now it is separated out in its own folder. I've also spent a little bit of time making sure that zip files are with their associated controllers. Now, I'm not going to stop here. I'm going to stop here for today's episode. But the point here is that you want to get started and get things organized in a good way, and then you can continue to work on this later. Again, this will eventually be changing to Swift, and a lot of these zibs will go away, and we're going to get a lot of things much more simple. So hopefully, overall, this whole entire organization will change over time. So again, it pretty much has the original structure to some extent, but I went ahead and grouped the files a little bit better for my liking. So I'm going to push this up, make this available again, put it back into the main branch, and you can download it and take a look at how I changed everything for now. I hope you learned a little bit about organizing files in Xcode, and feel free to drop me a note. Thanks, and I'm Thomas Moore.